Testing. Hi. Okay. Between Anais and myself, and I have to make sure we give at least half an hour to that. No, in fact, probably more time because I've made the voting on the debate a little more sophisticated than in semesters past by using Cyber Campus more fully. So, okay, so maybe before I hit the start attendance button, I just give you an update. I went to the Italian National Day celebrations at the Italian residence in UN Village, at the Italian ambassador's residence in UN Village on Hanam, close to Hanam subway station. And that's the first time in 3 years that they've had an event. And it was quite nice. Of course, as I told you, they made some changes. I was not allowed to bring anybody with me. 3 years ago, the last time it was held before the pandemic, I brought a student with me, but I couldn't bring a student this time. So I contacted them. He said, no, you can't bring anybody. And I assume it's because of COVID. They're still trying to limit um, attendance numbers a little bit. But it does seem that they tried to upgrade it was the best food I've ever had at that event. Like they've spent more money on better food, and which was already good, and also better wine. So, but it was nice to do that. But I got back, of course, a little bit late, and so come back a little bit tired. But you know, yeah, I get up really early, more than most people. And I go to bed earlier, more so than most people. So that's my issue. Okay, so let's do the start attendance, and the start attendance here is well, now I forgot to mention some important point about that event. They mentioned at the start of the event that June 2nd is the day they had a referendum in Italy in 1947 on whether or not to abolish the monarchy and become a republic. And they voted in a referendum to abolish the monarchy, and they made that their national day in Italy. That's because that's the day they voted to abolish the monarchy after World War II. because the monarchy was claimed or blamed in part for the disaster of Mussolini in World War II. But they didn't mention also in that event yesterday that the referendum by the people of Italy, and that referendum to vote whether or not to abolish the monarchy was really close. I think it was something like 52% in favor, 48% against. And the southern part of Italy, the Mezzogiorno, the poor areas, the areas that stereotyped as backward by Italian nationalists as backward, and they voted overwhelmingly. Most of them voted to keep the monarchy. Most of these struggle against the occupation regime of Germany when Italy switched sides. The civil war, the guerrilla war, the killing happened in the north, not in the south, because the southern part of Italy was already occupied by the Americans and the British when the Italians changed sides, and northern Italy stayed under occupation until the end of the war. So that's an interesting note that is relevant, of course, to this class regarding the nationalism and conflicts around identity in Italy and in Europe in general, and including class conflicts between the rural areas and the urban areas and so on. Okay, so let's do the start attendance, and the number is 161. 161, so make sure I go to chatting, put 161 in the chat function. 161. And okay, so that is your smart attendance number, and we are recording. So let's open up the lesson plan and look again at the lesson plan. We have this debate today. We have a short class, so we don't have much time, maybe just another 5 minutes before we go to the debate. In fact, maybe even less than that, because I have to shut down the computer in order to copy the file. And so maybe we should go straight to the debate. And let me ask first if Anais has anything that she wants to post or put on this computer, or of course, you can always just use Zoom and share your screen with everybody in the class. In fact, so I can remind myself to make the share screen option available. Of course, I can't remember quite how to do that. I don't know if this is this makes the share screen available to anybody who wants to access the share screen. But we should be able to share the screen. I know you can do it, but I don't know the Korean word for, okay, but you're able to see the lesson plan here. And the debate topic is, to South Koreans, all members of the European Union will eventually join the Eurozone. And I am pro, so I have to put down my microphone because I don't have a microphone over here. Oh no, sorry, yeah, this is the two. See, I'm tired. It's the 2 hours class. We don't have 1 hour, we have 2 hours. Okay, thank you for reminding me. This is the 2 hour class. So no, let's wait for the second hour then to do the do the debate. And all right, so then let me then go back to the notes that we were beginning to cover, and I'm thinking about how to put these notes within the context of the of theory or theoretical ideas that we can use to understand the significance of this chapter on Europeanization of European Union member state economies. Well, I made the point in another class, in the methodology class, about different national cultural expectations regarding the role of the government in playing an important role in developing, or whether or not to develop, the economy of the country through a strategy. And it's been a theme in other classes. I've mentioned that, for example, the Americans, because of their history, because of their attitudes, because of their romantic images of themselves in terms of their romantic national archetypes of what it means to be an American, they have difficulty conceptualizing or understanding that a state government should play a leading role and can play a leading role effectively in guiding the development of a society, to accelerate the economic development of that society to happen more quickly. Because typically labeling of Great Britain and the United States is that they're early industrializers, that Britain and the United States industrialized, were among the first countries to industrialize. Of course, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, right? And the United States was already part of the British Empire. And what was the United States, what became the United States was part of the British Empire. And so industrialization began in Britain and the United States without an overarching plan to make it happen. I mean, there were individual projects by British kings and French kings to develop what we call infrastructure projects, but there wasn't an overarching plan to develop the country in the way that we see, for example, in these other countries like Germany, like South Korea, like Japan, like France. So America and Great Britain are typically labeled as so-called early industrializers. They were early industrializers. And so industrialization happened without there being an overarching national commitment in the form of the state authorities to accelerate the development of our country for a number of reasons, including always, not only, but the need to develop a strong economy so you can have a strong military. That you need to have a strong economy so that you can make rifles and railroads, and that's good for the well-being of the people, but it's also important because you need to have a strong military in a Europe where you have competing countries. So the United States and Britain, they tend to, at least particularly the United States, less so Britain, as we talk about in American history, American politics class, they have this luxury. The Americans have this luxury of believing that economics and marketplace interaction, and the marketplace is a natural phenomenon that is not really created through politics. It's not created through state intervention. It's something that happens because it's a natural human tendency, and that government is in one extreme version, government is a necessary evil in this American conceptualization, because you have criminals, so you need a police, so you need a prison system, so you need a court system also to enforce contracts, because, you know, the middle class English people are all about contracts, right? Look at King James Bible, right? That Jehovah makes a covenant. Covenant's a fancy word for a contract between the people of Israel and him. So, you know, and that's what business people are all about, contracts. And this has become fetishized and romanticized, including in political science theory, in John Locke's theory of liberalism and his so-called contract theory of political democracy, that people submit to the government as part of a contract deal, that we submit to the authority of the government as long as the government protects our rights. And if the authorities do not protect our rights, life, liberty, and the ownership of property, according to John Locke, then we have the right to rebel and overthrow the king, even though the king might say, I rule by the will of God. No, you don't. You rule only insofar as you fulfill your obligations to us and to protect our human rights. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, other countries like France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, China, and of course, in the most, another case, the Soviet Union, they had to industrialize rapidly, and that was a conscious choice by people like Otto von Bismarck. Like Germany was a poor part of Europe in the mid-19th century, until Germany reunited under the blood and iron approach of Otto von Bismarck, and to develop Germany as rapidly as possible after 1870, 1871. So in these continental European countries, there's this greater expectation that, of course, the political authorities in the form of the state government should provide leadership in organizing and orchestrating societal forces, societal constituencies, groups, resources, in the way, for example, a symphony conductor conducts a symphony, right? That the state is the symphony orchestra conductor. And there are different parts within society. There's the string section, there's the woodwind section, there's the brass section, and they're all individually separate parts. But when you bring them together, you create something that is more than the whole. You get a symphony. And you need the orchestra conductor to organize and integrate all of these different components together. Now that's a nice way of looking at what we call corporatism, right? This is a corporatist approach to understanding economic development and politics more generally. And that was a theme that I have listed here in these notes for the lesson plan today. That liberalism, that's what I was referring to from John Locke and his predecessor Thomas Hobbes about the role of the state basically playing the role necessary in order to satisfy basic security needs of people. But basically economic market interaction is something that happens after security is established and you leave people alone to do business. This notion of liberalism, right? And liberalism in the more modern form in the 20th and 21st centuries emphasizes or tends to emphasize that politics is about different economic groups competing to influence the government, to shape government policy in a way to favor their own interests. And that's okay. I mean, as long as everybody obeys the rules and doesn't break the laws that exist, the outcome of this process of interest group policymaking within these societies, with all the struggle and push and pull by business people, farmers, trade unions, these different groups work, trying to shape government public policy. Government officials are sort of like a cash register or like the calculator. They don't play an independent, really an independent, significant role in guiding this process. There's less of a role for state leadership, except maybe during wartime. Because, you know, even John Locke, although John Locke was very skeptical about professional armies because he thought professional armies were a danger, because that's typically how the aristocrats justified their rule, that we, the traditional hereditary aristocracy of this country, rule for a number of reasons, including God wants us there, and also because we are the warrior class. We are the experts in war, and you need experts in war because this is a nasty world. And they use that justification to dominate, use their political power to dominate and control the society, to steal from the hardworking entrepreneurs and business owners, and prevent the emerging middle class from gaining the dignity and respect they deserve. And you know, and this, of course, is still reflected today in American thinking. You know, that what did Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, argue was the reason the Americans were going into World War I in 1917, to make the world safe for democracy, to fight the war that will end all wars. And how will that happen? Get rid of these Junker aristocrats in Germany and these aristocrats in continental Europe who are interfering with the natural tendencies for people to cooperate primarily through business. I mean, 80% of a typical human's social interaction is economic interaction, if you include their career, their paycheck. Remember, I couldn't be a college professor unless I got paid for it. So even my career, which is a creative endeavor, is feasible because I get money from it. And people have a natural predisposition to want to cooperate, but you have these bad apples, these archaic, outdated leaders from another medieval time, pre-modern time, convincing people that they should be in charge because they're the professional warrior class. And they interfere with the natural tendencies of people to cooperate, because since they have to justify their rule, they're claiming that, you know, the world's a nasty, dangerous place. So, and they will make crises. They will encourage international military conflicts because it's in their nature. So get rid of those people, establish democratic political systems, and free up international trade and commerce, and we will have, voila, peace. That was, of course, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points that in his speech he gave to the US Congress when asking for a declaration of war from the US Congress. That why are we going to war? And he says we're going to spread peace and prosperity in the world by freeing up international trade, making and creating democratic governments for oppressed people. So give Poland its own country, break up that thing called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and create countries out of that, put democratic governments in power, open up international trade and commerce, and we will get rid of most of the sources of war and conflict in the world today. That's liberalism. And of course, we all know what happened. It didn't work. But of course, that's the American experience, but it's unique to America in a sense. And that's still expressed, of course, even today, right? George Bush claiming that we need to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein in 2003 for a number of reasons, including to put a democratic political system in place in Iraq and make it a model for the rest of the Arab Middle East and stop this ongoing conflict and war in the Middle East by getting rid of these bad actors who are these gangsters, right? You have gangsters, you have criminals. And we've always known that in liberalism. You're gonna have a bad apple in the barrel, right? A bad apple, you know, something you eat. You have a bad apple in the apple barrel, it's gonna make all the other apples bad. So get rid of that bad apple. Get rid of those gangster criminals, those Saddam Husseins, those Slobodan Milosevic's, those Kim Jong-uns, and maybe Vladimir Putin, and you will have peace once you get rid of the gangsters, the criminals, the corrupt. And so it's still expressed today. This is not just a history lesson, but this is this notion of worldview. It's more like a worldview. Paradigm is a worldview. It's more broad than a theory in liberalism. And then there's Marxism, right? That politics is about class conflict it's inherently class conflict between not just aristocrats, but also bourgeois, middle class, capitalists, and the workers. And the workers can or may include farm workers, agricultural workers, as well as factory workers. And this is the source of conflict in the world. And you're not going to get rid of this conflict just by getting rid of the aristocrats, because then you have also still the capitalists, the de facto aristocrats, if not official aristocrats, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists who are exploiting the workers. And of course, they have an incentive to create violence as well, because through violence, war, they brainwash their people, and they fight over empire, right? This is what Vladimir Lenin argued, that World War I happened because France and Germany and Britain were fighting over how to divide up the rest of the world. And they needed to divide up the rest of the world for their own economic well-being, because supposedly capitalist economies were producing too much surplus, and they needed to have control over Africa and Latin America and Asia in order to dump their resources, their surplus production in those regions of the world, and exploit them for their own economic benefit, you know, in terms of cheap labor, cheap resources from Africa and India. And that's why they went to war, because they're fighting over how to divide up the world. And the Russian Empire, Russia was simply the most advanced colony out of all of this parts of the world. And that was the justification that Lenin gave for the Bolshevik Revolution, that if you broke that chain, if you took this Russian Empire out of the capitalist political and economic system by withdrawing from World War I, that it would be such a shock to the capitalist political and economic international system that it would trigger a revolution in Germany and in the other more industrialized parts of the world. And of course, it didn't quite happen that way. But then corporatism is the third paradigm, and this became popular when I was in school as an approach to understanding the role of the state in politics in relationship to the economy, in terms of political economy, what we call political economy. And corporatism has that term in it, corporate, which means body. And that's one way to keep in mind that in the corporatist paradigm or worldview, the state provides leadership. It provides leadership in the development, economic and political development of the community. And so it's more than just a cash register. It's more than just a calculator. It's an active leader, dynamic leader in this process of organizing society, like a symphony concert conductor, right? Is supposed to ideally organize societal resources to get the most efficient, rapid economic development possible in the world as it exists in 1871 or 1945 or 1953 in the form of South Korea, or what was the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the mid 19th century in Japan, or maybe the United States as well. And of course, but of course the Americans deny that they are corporatists. They are, because of American traditional political attitudes inherited from their founding and romanticized and stereotyped in terms of the romantic image, self-image that Americans have of being rugged individualists with the cowboy and the frontier. They don't see, even in the United States, the government plays a leading role in developing the United States, particularly since World War II, with the national security establishment, the Defense Department, and all the other departments that support containment against the Soviet Union. And this even began, of course, before the Cold War. It began during World War II. As I pointed out in my methodology class last meeting, that at the end of World War II, 11% of American manufacturing capacity, 11% of American, 11% of American workers worked in aerospace, building planes, this new industry, right? 11% of American workers were working in building aircraft because they were supplying the military during World War II. And on that basis, Boeing emerged as the dominant aerospace company in the world, that until the 1970s, the only company that produced airplanes that jet airplanes you could purchase was Boeing. Until the Europeans said, hey, you know what? We want to have an aerospace industry too. Because if you have an advanced aerospace industry, you have lots of good jobs, you generate lots of added value, you develop the social capital of your society by having really advanced suppliers to supply aviation electronics and jet engines, and your workers become very sophisticated, very skilled, and you make a lot of money. And so we want to do that. And of course, the Europeans didn't rely upon the Cold War in preparing to fight the Soviet Union, the Russian version of Nazi Germany. They didn't rely upon that as a justification for developing the Airbus industry that generates the Airbus planes that you fly today, either on Boeing or on Airbus. And they just did it because they understood that this is something they needed to do for the well-being of their countries. And they didn't do it because they wanted to contain the Soviet Union. And the Americans had to have a big problem with that. Like, the Americans say, what we did is okay. That's okay, but you Europeans, you're unfairly supporting your domestic companies in competing against Boeing through government subsidies, through giving them aid and assistance that we don't give our companies. Of course they do. But the Americans don't want to accept that. They say, no, we were just buying the products of American companies to supply the military that we needed to save you from the Russian version of Nazi Germany. But of course, it de facto served as a strategy, an industrial strategy, a development industrial strategy. Boeing always knew it could sell, it had a guaranteed customers to buy its products. So they could engage in more long-term planning as a company, because they always knew the Defense Department of the United States government was going to buy lots of their products. I mean, the first jet plane that Boeing sold, the 707, right, was developed from a military product that they provided for the US military. But the Americans think that's okay, because that was done as part of our effort to, even John Locke said, you have to have a military sometimes. And now we have nuclear weapons. We can't go to war like we did in World War I and World War II, because if we have World War III, there'll be no more world with nuclear weapons. So yeah, the Cold War lasted a long time, but no, it's not the same. All of the technologies, all of the industries that emerged in the United States during the Cold War, that's not the same as a government subsidization of economic competitors unfairly supporting those companies that are therefore unfairly competing against our companies for our access to customers with new products. It's not the same. And you think about all of the economic products and technologies that emerged during the Cold War, from semiconductors that make these computers possible. That was developed by the US military. The Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA. The internet, again, something created strongly with the support of the US military, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And look, we're using internet right now for video conferencing. I could go on and on and on about all these products and technologies that emerged that helped make the United States the dominant developed economy in the world. And so this is pointed out basically as the government providing leadership, in the state authorities in the form of the government providing leadership. And the Europeans, they have more of an acceptance of this. And they have more of an acceptance of this if you take my American politics class and American history classes, because they've always had this stronger view that in fact the government should be the head of the body. You know, corporate means body, and the head is the government, the authorities are the brain of the body politique. You need a brain. And the Europeans, particularly continental Europeans, but also British, have a stronger sense that, of course, the government should provide leadership. And you know, the brain cannot exist without a heart, without the other organs. So we all have our place in the body politique. Some of the parts of the body are not very pleasant, but they're very necessary. You know? And so don't be ashamed if you're a worker. If I'm the traditional aristocrat ruling in Germany or France, because France got rid of its aristocracy, but still there's an implicit one there, that's okay. And you're a peasant or you're a worker, you know, we need peasants, we need workers. And but let's work together. Let's work together, and the head of the body politique will try to organize and coordinate the manufacturers and the farmers and the service financial institutions together. And you will trust me enough as the head of the government, because of my historical lineage, because of the traditional role of the monarchy and the aristocracy, that you will even share secret information with me, manufacturers. And you have, of course, manufacturing peak organizations that represent many, if not most, or maybe even most manufacturers in the steel industry or in the car industry. And you'll share information to me that's secret, and you'll actually trust me not to give that to some competitors or use it in a way that will hurt you. And I, as the legacy inheritor of this noblesse oblige tradition, have this high status within society. Even though I might not make as much money as you, people respect me, and I am respected. Americans, they don't respect the government. They're suspicious of the government. I mean, I'm making an overstatement, but you know, for the longest time in the United States, we had a slang expression, right? That do something that's not very good, but it's good enough for government work. We are suspicious in our natural predisposition that we inherited through our institutionalized history, right? That big government bad. You know, when your doctor tries to test your reflexes and takes a little hammer and hits your knee with the hammer, you know, when you natural reflex, you don't even think about it, right? So the United States is like, big government bad, big government bad. Even though, of course, we all like our big government when it serves our interests. When we get lots of money working in the military, we build a career in the military, in this huge entity that now is $800 billion a year, and I have all the benefits and security without the cost. I luckily don't get hurt or killed in the military, and I can retire after 20, 25 years and get all the benefits of that. Or in the civilian world, we also have unemployment insurance now in the United States since the 1930s, and we have old age medical care, the medical insurance system called Medicare. We like that, but big government bad. Europeans don't go big government bad. They don't think like that. But the Americans do. But even though they still, of course, you need big government in this world of developed, advanced economies that are interdependent with each other. And so this is corporatism. And this is the third major paradigm or worldview for understanding how European Union policymaking and European institutions interrelate with each other. And of course, this is a little bit easier for continental Europe because of their stronger role that the governments played in these continental states in organizing the economies and developing the economies of these countries. in order to develop and catch up with Britain and the United States in their economic industrialization, beginning in the late 19th century. And so neo-corporatism is nice corporatism. You know, that's the neo-corporatism, because typically this has a bad connotation. Corporatism was associated with fascism. Like conservative Catholic politicians talked about sodalities, and they talked about Pope Leo the 11th in the late 19th century wrote his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was his explanation of the role of the response to the threat of communism and capitalism. And that's an important point to keep in mind also, right? That this corporatist doctrine, as it developed explicitly as an idea, as a doctrine, was often in response to the perceived threat of communism and the Catholic Church's response to it, right? So like, get this out of the way here. So I think it's Rerum Novarum. Yeah. And this was the Pope's explicit response to Pope Leo XIII, sorry, in 1891, about his worldview, about the role of the government and basically noblesse oblige, that French term that the nobility, legitimated by the by the church often, right? This is the term I think in French, right? The noble obligation of the aristocracy to take care of you, the peasant and the worker, because that's why I'm in the nobility. And of course, which state adopted the first modern social welfare policies that we associate with modern developed social welfare states today, like unemployment insurance? Was it the United States? No, it was Bismarck's Germany. Bismarck's Germany. After Germany was united, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of the Junker class, Mr. Aristocracy, skeptical of democracy, he instituted unemployment insurance to keep German workers from becoming more radical and supporting communism and Marxism. Under Bismarckian Germany adopted the first modern unemployment insurance and old age pension policies. Well, I mean, the Americans also began after the Civil War giving old age pensions to veterans from the war, but this was the first. This is important because this is the first ideological articulation explicitly of this notion of corporatism, and keeping in mind also it illustrates the reaction to the threat of Marxism and radicalism as workers are living in horrible conditions in industrializing societies, working 7 days a week for 12 hours a day, and kids not able to go to school because they have to work to make some money so the family can buy enough food to eat, and so on. So rights and duties of capital and labor, right, is the English translation. And so this is often cited as one of the most important articulations of this notion of corporatism. And but then this got caught up with the increasing militancy of nationalism in Europe, and then when what we call fascist regimes began to emerge. Well, of course, during World War I, we began to see in the First World War these governments of these states intervene in their societies to achieve an objective, which is to develop the military and utilize the economic resources to win the war. And to show that this can be done, the governments can explicitly intervene to more effectively during a crisis situation to control all elements of society for wartime objectives. And then, of course, people like Mussolini picked that up. And Mussolini and Franco in Spain and Mussolini in Italy were all about corporatism. And they explicitly used that term. So corporatism got a bad rap. It got associated with fascism. Again, versus Marxism, Leninism, communism. But then after World War II, this term neo-corporatism emerged to show how still, even in democratic states, like in post-World War II Austria or post-World War II Sweden, that these are democratic countries, but still you see in these liberal democracies the state taking a leadership role through its civil service, through its officials, in organizing, reconciling disputes within society. Yeah, they might, the workers in Austria or Germany might go on strike, but they go on strike only for like a few days. They don't go on strike for weeks and months, you know, because they know typically the point that is made in these notions is that these are economies that are dependent upon international commerce and trade. And that means they have to be competitive when they're competing against countries with much lower standards of living, with paying workers much lower wages, that they still need to be competitive. And so one of the most important, do I have it here? Books that illustrated this, that's still in print, and I guess I don't have it on this, but I can go to, I mean, I can just go here to show this, this book. And I wonder what comes up on Wikipedia. Let me see if I can find it on Wikipedia. I've never looked this up on Wikipedia. Peter Katzenstein's Small States in World Markets. And this book is still in print. And it was written, you know, in the late 1970s, it was published. Does it come up? No, it doesn't come up. Okay, so then we have to go to Amazon. Just to show you. I never checked to see if it's actually got a Wikipedia entry. But if you go to so you go to Amazon and you look here, Small States and World Markets. Where did it go? Maybe I remember the author. Yeah, that's it. Didn't come up. But this book, Small States and World Markets, Industrial Policy in Europe. And he was the one that really, in this book, that really illustrated this tendency and looked at small states like Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands. And it was written a long time ago. It was written, the most recent edition is 2015, but I think it was first published in like the late 1970s. At least that's when I read it when I was in school, and it's not really letting me go. By the early 1980s, right? So he covers Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, and Austria, and this, you know, highlights this nice form of corporatism, but this notion that the labor and industry, in the form of their representative peak associations, that at the top of these societies for the manufacturing industrial sector, there are groups and organizations that can claim to speak for most, if not all, of steel manufacturers or farmers, and that the government orchestrates society working through these so-called peak associations to organize this, the society to limit inefficient conflicts that make the overall products of these economies that are developed and wealthy less competitive in a world where we have emerging Japan and emerging United States and now emerging China. And he says that Germany is like this, but of course he's writing about West Germany before it was unified. But West Germany is a big country, and he said it, you know, in his book that Germany shows a lot of these predispositions as well. And of course, you all know that Germany, at least 1/3 of its economy depends upon exports and imports. This rich, prosperous country that pays its workers well, with lots of nice benefits to people living there, is very competitive with China, with India, with the United States. So you don't have to be poor to be competitive. You don't have to pay your workers. Your workers do not have to live poor quality of life in order to have cheap labor, to have efficient, competitive products that can compete on the world market. So, so that's the context of this discussion that we're having here regarding regarding the Europeanization of European economies. And of course, and let's see, what is this? Okay, so I don't need all that. You know, again, the British are the outlier because, again, the British, they have a better respect or acceptance of the role of the government in the society, but the British are still, even to this day, I would suggest, immersed in and entranced by their empire. Remember, the British, not correctly, but the typical British view is that they have nothing to be ashamed of to be British nationalists. That their state history, unlike the history of reunified Germany, Germany reunifies and it gives us Hitler. And before Hitler, Kaiser Wilhelm. Italy unifies under liberalism and it gives us Mussolini in the 1920s. Boo! That never happened to the British. The British Empire never lost a war. Of course, they did horrible things in their empire, but let's not talk about Asia and Africa because we don't want to talk about Asia and Africa because I won't go into that racist tropes that they would throw out, right? That we brought civilization to those people, so on and so on. But that Britain could thrive and prosper in the world by being the center of first its empire, then its legacy in the form of the informal economic and political institutions left behind by the empire. The British banking system, the British banks, the British connections. And of course, this didn't work. So as the British economy was growing at very low rates after World War II, whereas Germany and France and Italy and Japan are going through their so-called economic miracles, that was the term that was used, the German economic miracle, even the Italian economic miracle, the Japanese economic miracle, the French economic miracle. Britain was growing at 1 or 2% a year, with lots of labor strife and labor unions going on strike in so many different industries. And they're being humiliated by the loss of their empire that they went to war to protect in World War I. Then after World War II, they lose it. And then of course the troubles in Ireland escalate. And in this context, as we highlighted, the British authorities decided we need to get into the European Union or the European Economic Community. And Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France, says, no, because you British, you're not really truly European enough, in my view, as Charles de Gaulle, the great French leader who had his own grandeur aspirations for France. And he kept rejecting Britain's application to join the European Economic Community from the first time they applied in the early 1960s until they finally got in after de Gaulle resigned. And Britain and Denmark and Ireland joined the European Community in 1973. Then, of course, Margaret Thatcher comes to power. We talked about this already in a previous class. And this is relevant for the Europeanization of European economies because Margaret Thatcher engaged in a policy of privatizing the Marxist socialist policies, undermining and ending the Marxist social policies of post-war governments that it concluded the British government controlling the most important industries in Britain. So you don't remember this, but I remember when British Air, that was a British government-controlled company, right? British Steel was a government-controlled company. British Post and British Rail, these are all government-controlled companies that were nationalized or dominated by the government after World War II in order to stabilize the economy and give benefits and security to the British workers who supposedly, bore the brunt of the costs of fighting and winning World War II. And Margaret Thatcher, during this period of economic malaise and slow growth and labor unrest in the 1970s, along with the escalating violence in Northern Ireland, said the problem is too much socialism. And so she came to power in 1979 and privatized as much as possible, including, like, for example, the public housing that was provided to German workers, there were millions of apartments that had been created or built to provide housing for poor workers who didn't have their own house. She said, okay, you're going to own this. They privatized all of the apartments that were built, give them property, make them property owners. Privatize and stop subsidizing the coal mines. I mean, there was a time there was, I think, 300,000 coal miners working in British coal mines in Britain. And these coal mines were inefficient. They couldn't compete with American coal, Australian coal. But they were kept in business through government subsidizing those coal mines. And she privatized them all. There was massive labor strikes and fights, and the British police on their horses charging into the coal miners. And she privatized them all. And today they're all gone. There is no coal industry. And those cities in northern England where those coal mines were based, they're just ghost towns. Well, they've been, of course, torn down. Only now are they starting to build new coal mines in Britain to mine a particular kind of coal that used for steel making. And she privatized the British Air and the British steel companies, and Britain went from being the sick man of Europe, as it was described, borrowing a term to describe the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, to become the fastest growing major economy in Europe. And as the continental countries of Europe had their own economic problems, the claim was made that they need to learn from Margaret Thatcher's Britain. They need to privatize. They need to loosen up the labor market. They got to make it easier to hire and fire, including fire workers, as well as hire them. You know, with these socialist labor policies, it was very difficult to fire somebody. It's still very difficult to fire somebody in South Korea. And that meant low economic unemployment, but greater and greater economic disparity between the rich and the poor. And she was able to do that for a number of reasons, including reminding the British of their previous glorious time when Argentina occupied the Falkland Islands colonies of Great Britain off the coast of Argentina, claiming those are Argentinian islands, that they're the Malvinas, not the Falklands. And Argentina military dictatorship, the junta in Argentina, decided to invade and take those islands and add them to Argentina, that the British wouldn't fight back about it too much, and it would bring glory and honor to the Argentinian military dictatorship. And of course, Margaret Thatcher sent the British Navy, this is 40 years ago in 1982, despite losing a couple ships and killing hundreds of Argentinian sailors, Britain won that Falklands War. Let me see here. Yes, 40 years ago today. And once again, the British island, the British United Kingdom, the British lion roared. Arr, arr. And even though, of course, Britain was in great economic recession at the time, this provided with Margaret Thatcher with the ability to appeal to British nationalism, and she won re-election in 1982. Would she have won had the Argentinian junta not occupied Falklands? I don't know, but they reclaimed the islands, even though there's only 1,400 people who live there. Almost nobody lives there. These little islands off the coast of Argentina, and then of course the economies recovered, and then of course the Cold War began to come to the end when Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. And it becomes clear to the European community that something important is going on in the Soviet Union. And so Margaret Thatcher works with Francois Mitterrand, the president of France, and Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of West Germany, to accelerate economic integration of Europe, partly in response to, we need to do something to get ready because something important is really going on in the Soviet Union. And even though she was kind of skeptical, she was supportive of creating a single market, but not really going beyond that. And I showed you the video clips of her right before she was ousted, complaining about plans for political integration of the European Union, that she didn't want that. She doesn't want the creation of a new European political bodies that could oversee the state national governments, and then she was ousted, partly because she was seen as too anti-European. But in terms of this class's theme, her remedy for the economic slowdown of British economy was talked about for years afterwards, until Brexit and the pandemic, as the model that Italy and East European countries, the former communist countries, they have to follow. The Greeks, they have to privatize their state-owned industries, privatize as much as possible, not just the industries, even the utilities, the post office, privatize the post office, privatize the railroads, privatize as much as possible. And of course, then when Boris Johnson, well, then the Brexit referendum happens, this, of course, disrupts much of this discussion, and then Donald Trump gets elected in the United States at the same year in 2016, and with all of the disruption that generated, and so there's been confusion in the European integration project, with Donald Trump encouraging Euroscepticism, encouraging people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, applauding Boris Johnson and the conservative parties, attacking the European Union, and then the pandemic happens, right? And everything is focused on the pandemic, and now, of course, we have the latest war with the latest crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's the context for understanding this discussion of the Europeanization of national economies. What does that mean? Are we still supposed to follow Margaret Thatcher's remedy prescription for these problems? Privatize, privatize, privatize. So yeah, there's this discussion that I think it's a she, is the author of this chapter. You know, Vivian, it sounds like a female. She says that there have been three varieties of capitalism have appeared in Europe: liberal market economies such as Britain and Ireland, and of course that was one of the justifications that Margaret Thatcher used about Britain, and of course the pro-Brexit people argued is that Europe was trying to make Britain's political economic system become more corporatist, and supposedly they had experience with that model under their socialist policies, that making it more difficult to hire and fire workers. That was typical in Britain until Margaret Thatcher came to power, and they don't want to go back to that. And the social justice doctrines of the European Union enforced by the European Court of Justice, violating British sovereignty, and and of course this assumption underpinning this all was that Britain has other options. Britain does not need Europe to thrive. I mean, of course it needs Europe to thrive, but it has other capabilities, including the former British Empire, including its close and best big power ally, the United States. So Boris Johnson was always promising that, with Donald Trump in office, if we leave the European Union, we'll have a free trade agreement with the United States. That's what he was promising to voters to support him and his plans to get Brexit done, that we can make a free trade agreement with the United States. And of course also, and what did he do after he came into power? He joined the Comprehensive Free Trade Trans-Pacific Partnership, along with Canada and Australia and Mexico and Japan. It joined the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership that Donald Trump withdrew from to get access to the Pacific area, including two countries that have Pacific coastlines, Australia and Canada. That Britain has other capabilities. It doesn't need to cooperate with Britain, with the rest of Europe, as tends to dominate in thinking in Italy and Germany and France, with their more tragic histories of embarrassment and defeat. So there's more liberal perspectives in Britain and Ireland. Of course, Ireland is still very much pro-European Union, but Ireland, that's a small country, right? Total of what, 5 million, 6 million, 5.5 million people in the entire island of Ireland. And then coordinated market economies. Coordinated, that's the code word for corporatists, right? Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Austria. They have post-war collaborative inter-firm relations and cooperative labor management relations, corporatism, right? An enabling state facilitates this process of cooperation. You know, Americans, they don't like, they get very suspicious of this, even though of course I don't want to use slang psychology, they're schizophrenic. Big government bad, but we got this huge military supply infrastructure. I mean, I think at least 10% of America's manufacturing capacity is tied up with supplying the Defense Department. 10%. And of course, they're even talking in these terms today, although, again, when you use terms like corporatism and industrial policy, there's a reaction, but they say, they use the term resiliency, that now that the rise of China, the new enemy, it's not the Soviet Union, it's China, the People's Republic of China under the Chinese Communist Party, they're controlling too much of the global climate change, so we have to have we have to reshore more of our own industrial capacity, and we have to be able to produce our own masks without having to buy them from foreign countries, and build our own semiconductor plants to produce the most advanced semiconductors in the United States. And they never use the term corporatist. They talk about reshoring, they talk about national security, they talk about the challenge from the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party. To provide government to provide incentives to Intel, for example, big American semiconductor manufacturer, is going to build a $20 billion semiconductor plant in my home state of Ohio. And they got all of these incentives and promises from the state government of Ohio and the national government to build this new vast industrial enterprise in central eastern Ohio. And the claim is we have to have it because we've got to deal with countries like China. And of course, this was announced before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Coordinated wage restraint by the social partners. See, that's so nice. That's so neo-corporatist. We're social partners. Also provided benefits. Of course, under Mussolini's Italy or Franco's Spain, this was my social partner. You workers will do what I tell you. You will join the unions that we put you in, and if you don't listen, you'll disappear. State-influenced market economies. Of course, these are, they display post-war intervention state, which organizes collaboration between firms, direct business investment, and imposes labor management cooperation. Of course, you know, this was communist and authoritarian until Franco died in 1975. This was a military dictatorship until 1974, 75. France was in turmoil until de Gaulle came in and used his charisma as leader of France. And of course, advocated European integration as a way by which to make France look good in the world when, you know, it's a small country. How are you going to compete with the Soviet Union and the United States? France leading Europe. And Italy as a problematic country where the Cold War was really intensely fought indirectly between the KGB and the CIA, interfering inside Italian politics to keep the communists out. I mean, I showed you my passport, right? How influential the Italian Communist Party was in Italy because it was seen as the leader of the resistance struggle against the occupying Germans at the end of the Second World War. And that was mostly in northern Italy, not southern Italy, right? So they have transformed themselves, but they're indistinguishable from both the coordinated market and liberal economies because the state continues to occupy a defining role. So, yeah, I mean, Italy is, they have not privatized as much. I mean, they haven't, like the Germans privatized their postal system. So did the British. The Italians haven't done that. Although they probably should. I mean, my father, you know, he was an Italian immigrant who came to the United States, and he used to send home, he was just a construction worker, and he used to send home a little money in an envelope to his sister in Rome. He did that like every week for forever. And then he found out like 25, 30 years ago, they never got the money because somebody at the post office was opening up the envelope and taking it. That's why you privatize, right? That people who fight corruption say, as a general rule of thumb, wherever you're fighting corruption in Africa and Asia, privatize. Privatize. Not always, but that's always a good first step. For these states, the global financial crisis was not as much as a challenge to them as it was the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So again, this is all written before the pandemic, still talking and focusing upon the 2008-2010 world financial crisis and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, and then also in 2015 with the immigration crisis that largely fueled Brexit. But the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis impacted them more because of the more prominent central role of national governments in either enhancing or hindering economic activity. And again, the response of Europe to that sovereign debt crisis was more European integration, including the strengthening of the European Central Bank to become one of the most important, powerful institutions in the European Union. And it's only 23 years old. And then the pandemic just ballooned, escalated it even further. And let's see what the war in Ukraine will do. So we need to go to our debate and, of course, highlighting the economic growth rates in these countries. So you can see, these common statistics are hard to validate. Bulgarians, because they were a pampered member of the communist bloc, because they were so pro-Soviet. They were often called the 16th Republic of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had 15 republics. Bulgaria actually applied twice under the Communist Party to join the Soviet Union, to give you a sense of just how pro-Soviet the Bulgarians were. And it paid off. They got all sorts of subsidies from Moscow, including in energy, including having favored economic investments. Bulgarians, they still, when I was there 15 years ago, they were still talking about how good things were in Bulgaria under Brezhnev time, when Brezhnev was dictator of the Soviet Union until he died in 1982. That was the high point of living well in Bulgaria. Food was everywhere, it was good, it was cheap. Anyway, so all right, so we need to go to the debate. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to save this slide. So let's go to the debate and go to lesson plan. And so to South Koreans, all members of the European Union will eventually join the Eurozone. So I am in the debate, so I am going to set my timer and go to, set the security system as what it's worth. Go to so just a second here. So I'm going to go to timer, go to 6 minutes, 06, start. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see the screen in my comments that I wrote on your paragraphs, I'm going to repeat those comments here, right? That with this incredible, really acceleration, maybe it's not incredible, but it's still amazing to me, the speed with which this process of European integration is accelerated in the European Union, that countries that are not in the Eurozone, that are in the European Union, they are surely going to experience greater and greater political pressure to have their voice in this increasingly important and powerful economic actor in the world stage. Of course, it still requires, in terms of these levels of analysis that I've been talking about in this class, individuals have to make this decision, individual leaders have to make this decision to make it happen. But on a state level and an international system level, the three levels, right? Individual, state, and international system level, the incentives at the state and international system level are going to be increasingly strong. Because even if you're a nationalist who loves Sweden, because Sweden's not in the Eurozone, this European Union and the Eurozone, that in the Euro is truly an important actor. And it's become so in the last 2 years when the European Union is selling Euro bonds in euros, hundreds and hundreds of billions of euros being dispensed, sold, loaned, Euro bonds being sold in euros to investors around the world. And if you're not in the Eurozone, you're not sitting on the central board of governors that directs the European Central Bank. You do not have a direct voice in setting monetary policy. You have the president of the European Central Bank, who's a Frenchman, a French woman, Christine Lagarde, who had been the, I think the leader of the IMF previously, and she took the job to become director of the European Central Bank. And the board of the European Central Bank is the president of each member state that is in the Eurozone, their central bank. So the Bundesbank chairman sits on that board, is part of that board, like the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, right? It's, Christine Lagarde is not God. She can't, do things whatever she wants. She's got to have a consensus and build agreement among the members who sit on the board, just like the president of the American Federal Bank, of the Federal Reserve Bank, Jay Powell. He's got a board of governors in the American Federal Reserve, and they represent the different regions of the United States, and he works closely with them. But Jay Powell is the representative. He's the face. When the U.S. Federal Reserve has to speak to somebody, to the Congress or to the executive branch, it's Jay Powell. That's his job. He's the president of the Federal Reserve. Yeah, but he is not the Stalin of the dollar system in the United States. So Sweden is not in the Eurozone. So even though Sweden has this strong aristocratic corporatist tradition with strong effective government, it doesn't have a seat at the table. And even as the Eurozone and the European Union, European Monetary Union institutions are developing and strengthening and becoming more and more powerful actor in the international environment, Sweden's doesn't have a voice directly. And that means Sweden's influence in the world. I know it's a small country of what, 9 million people, 10 million people? It's not big. But how can small countries have more influence in the world? Through the European Union. That's one of the big selling points of the European Union. It's how small countries play a leadership role in the world because they can't do it on their own. They do it because the member states of the European Union agree to support each other. So when Sofia speaks to Moscow, or when Copenhagen speaks to Beijing, it's not just Denmark speaking to Beijing, it's the European Union speaking to Beijing. When Lithuania begins to recognize Taiwan as a legitimate actor in international affairs by allowing Taiwan to open up a Republic of Taiwan office in Lithuania. Little Lithuania, country of 3 million people, how can it do that? It can do that because it's in the European Union. And China can try to punish Lithuania, but if China punishes Lithuania, it's punishing the European Union. And so little Lithuania gets all this global attention. And Lithuania is in the Eurozone. The Baltic states, not coincidentally, are on the border with Russia, and they are the last countries to get into the Eurozone. Lithuania, I think, was the last one to join in 2007 or something like that. And Croatia wants to join. And so Sweden's not in. Is Sweden forever is going to stay out? Is Denmark forever going to stay out? Sweden and Finland have both applied to join NATO, and I know NATO is not part of the European Union, but of course they're so closely interconnected, right? Denmark just had a referendum to join in the cooperating with the European Union on its common foreign security policies, which they had been hesitant to do, but they are now doing it because of this concern and fear regarding Russia. The problem is referendums. I mean, and somehow the leaders of these countries, they all want to join the Eurozone. If you're Norway, you want to join the European Union. But for some reason, a referendum was put into these requirements for these countries to join, and that is more of an obstacle than a benefit. And so the question is, will the leaders of these countries be able to overcome or circumvent those requirements for popular approval on a mass vote to be able to join the Eurozone? So I will now turn over the microphone to Khan. What I set up all these sophisticated voting, complicated voting votes in the on the cyber campus. So Pro just made its opening statement, right? So you can see Pro opening statement, and oh, that's from a previous class. I have to scroll down here. So Pro opening statement. Yes, there it is. Pro opening statement. So you can vote as to how I did. Excellent, good, satisfactory, limited, or poor. You can vote there, and then we will now go to Khan to make its opening statement. So, Khan.
Okay, so I will actually talk about Sweden at the end of my presentation. But first, let's see the first factor as to why not all countries will join the Eurozone. So I want to talk about the sovereign debt crisis, which happened over 10 years ago, and we still see the side effects today. So it started in Greece when the new government discovered that the previous one hid the real government spending and debt. So it rose the public debt to GDP ratio to 146% in 2010, and it still rose in the years after.
Testing, okay.
Okay, so because Greece was part of the Eurozone, Eurozone countries were more impacted, yes, than the non-Eurozone countries. So for example, Ireland was more impacted than the UK. So in Ireland, this crisis caused important housing, an important housing crisis. So their public debt to GDP ratio rose to 120% in 2012. As for Spain, they had some of the best fiscal policy before this crisis, but nonetheless, with the impact this crisis had on Spain, it's also caused important housing bubble, as important housing crisis as the bubble collapsed again, along with their major banks. So I forgot to mention what happened to Greece. So for Greece, they had a high deficit, who had not been paid by the taxes. And their public administration was highly corrupted. So they received bailouts under careful watch of the European Union and the IMF. Nonetheless, it did not suffice in solving the issue. So they had increase on poverty and debt, as well as inequality. And what happened to Greece actually was the case for most European countries following the crisis. So we can see that one country had an important impact on all of the Eurozone. But why were so many impacted? Well, it was due to the European Union slow reaction to this crisis. And also they made a mistake in analysis the problem, and they gave the wrong solutions as they did not focus on growth and investments. So this crisis stopped many countries of the Eurozone from developing and growing. and also countries not from the Eurozone, especially Eastern Europe countries. And for most countries, as I said before, they still haven't recovered and their growth has highly slowed down. So this crisis can be really scary for non-Eurozone members as they still saw an impact on their countries even without the Eurozone. So they can be scared of what if there was another crisis, as they still haven't recovered from the one that happened 10 years ago. Furthermore, following this crisis, the European Union created the Banking Union, but no other countries who were not part of the Eurozone joined. And one of these policy of the Banking Union, one of the goals, was to apply common rules for the central banks. And the reason why the countries who were not part of the Eurozone did not join was that they didn't want, they wanted to keep their economy and their banking freedom, as it also allowed them higher deficits. And I will define the criteria of to join the Eurozone later. Yes, so finally I want to develop more on what were the wrong solutions the European Union gave. So they blamed it on the public debt, but the professional knew that it was actually private debt. So it engaged a lack of trust in the European Union governments for many countries. And furthermore, the reality was that the structure of the Eurozone, or the Euro in general, was the problem. And that the austerity policies they developed to quickly stop deficits only developed redevaluation of the countries. So that's why I think not all European countries will join the Eurozone.
Okay, and of course, if anybody has questions, they're welcome to ask questions. And okay, so then we have pro rebuttal. So let me go to pro rebuttal and so scroll down here. Pro rebuttal. Okay, so here we go. All right, so you can always ask questions and. Cancel. So my rebuttal is 4 minutes long. So, ladies and gentlemen, the point about the crises that my esteemed opponent is highlighting is a critical reason for explaining the development of European integration. Right? What was the reaction of Europe and the Eurozone and the European Central Bank to the debt crisis in Greece and the Irish and Spanish and Portuguese banking crises? The tremendous expansion, not expansion, but tremendous deepening, because they talk about widening European integration, which means adding new member states, and deepening European integration. And European integration has accelerated in its deepening so much in response to these crises. Right? It was during the Greek debt crisis when Mario Draghi, now the Prime Minister of Italy, when he was the second and most important president of the European Central Bank, said, quote, he issued just a few very critical rules. You know, this is a relatively young institution, just 10 years old. He said, we will do whatever it takes to make sure Greece does not default on its loans. In other words, the European Central Bank was going to print money to buy Greek bonds so that Greece would never default on its payments to its creditors, from which it had borrowed money by selling Greek government debt financing bonds, government debt bonds to them. And that was called, as I described earlier, in the Financial Times International Press, Mario Draghi's big bazooka. That the European Central Bank, once a country joins the central bank, will never default on its loans because the rest of Europe will, meaning Germany for the most part, will come up with the money because the European Central Bank relies upon Germany's creditworthiness, Germany's reputation in the whole world as being the most secure, solid debtor that you can't even, it's so safe and secure that when you buy German bonds, you even lose money because the interest that they pay you back is less than the inflation rate over time. But you know, like I said, you have this money laying around, you're an investor, you got to do something with it for the next 6 months. You can't just let it sit. So put it somewhere. And the European Central Bank relies upon that. And you continue to see how in response to the crisis of the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, that we see the European integration process is accelerating, including particularly in the Eurozone area. And this was always highlighted and forecast by some of the founders of the European Union. I think it might have been Jean Monnet who said, European integration occurs in response to crises. And these are not the first crises that the European Union has experienced. But these are the latest. And we're seeing this. It's not covered in your textbook. It's so important and it's so recent that the textbook is, you know, at least 2 years, more than 2 years old in terms of when the chapters were written, more like 2.5 years old. And they don't cover all this tremendous acceleration in the deepening of European integration, including in the monetary financial sector. And all I'm arguing is that if you're a proud Swede or you're a proud Dane, you increasingly see that you are not having as much influence in the world as you could if you were in the Eurozone. And other countries are going to join the Eurozone, like Croatia. I just saw this morning, little Croatia, 4.5 million people. They're like the Baltic states. They desperately want to feel like they're part of Europe, and that means joining the Eurozone. They want in the Eurozone. Bulgaria wants in the Eurozone. Please let us in the Eurozone, please, please. And so more and more of these countries are viewing the European integration as real and as substantive, and is something that really there's a cost to the country by not being in the Eurozone. And the question is, how long will it take for more and more people in these societies to recognize that if they have to have a referendum to have it approved? Now that, again, so I guess I'll stop there. If anybody has any questions, they can always ask. You can send a chat message or whatever to indicate they want to ask a question for an extra credit point. But I'll check the computer to see if anybody wants to do that. But right now I will turn over the microphone to Khan for rebuttal conclusion.
Okay, so now I want to talk about my second criteria, which is actually the Eurozone criteria. So first of all, I want to remind of the exact criteria put in place by the Stability and Growth Pact. So the budget deficits needs to be lower than 3% of the GDP, and the national debt should be lower than 60% of the GDP, and the countries will get a fine if they go over. But the reality is that all countries are very highly differentiated, and there is not a one-fit-for-all answer. As an example, state-influenced economies such as France, Spain, and Greece struggle more with those rules as they have weak governments. And I found it very surprising that even France, who is one of the main actors of the European Union, Germany, has struggled to deal with those rules. So I would get why it's smaller for us. It is scary for smaller economic countries who do not use to the euro as of today to join the euro. So to give a concrete example, I want to talk about Poland and Bulgaria, or more in general, Eastern Europe. So the new market reforms don't include market-correcting social policies, which the European Union also lacks. And they have highly corrupted countries. So does that remind you of Greece? And we know like the crisis that happened in Greece. So both the European Union and the countries do not trust each others, because what if those countries lie like the Greece did? And furthermore, the current Polish laws clash with the Eurozone policies as of today. So finally, then I want to talk about Sweden, which actually does meet the requirements but is not joining. So I understand that they would get to have more power and get a seat in the IMF. But despite meeting all the requirements, they are not joining because they did a referendum in 2003, where the people voted not to join. But so we can see that almost a 20-year-old referendum, like even if the referendum was almost 20 years ago, they have not done another one or started talks again to join. So we can see that they are most likely not inclined to join, and probably won't ever, as they have been avoiding discussion and postponing it. So this sets a path for future countries who someday might meet requirements. It shows that they won't be forced to join the Eurozone, as they can postpone it, even if they supposedly will have to join the Eurozone someday. And the last example is Denmark. So Denmark has negotiated opt-out from the beginning to not join the Eurozone. So the rate of member states who are part of the Eurozone will never achieve 100%. So once again, it shows that there are other options for future countries who meet the requirements someday to not join the Eurozone. So that's actually it for me.
Okay. So then I will go to pro conclusion. And okay, so so the key, I think, factor, again, is crises, right? So what's the most recent crises or evident crises that might incentivize more countries who are in the European Union to join the Eurozone so that all of them are in the Eurozone? We see emerging now discussion of a discrepancy between France and Germany pressuring Ukraine to make concessions with Russia over the territory of Ukraine, and being resisted, however, by the United States and the US government. And that's not surprising, because the Americans have always had this institutionalized Cold Warrior view of Moscow as being the evil empire, more so than the Europeans. And I think that goes back to at least the early 1950s, that the Europeans have not seen the Soviet Union or Moscow more generally as a belligerent, aggressive power. So the point is, if this is a crisis that's going to lead to some kind of critical juncture in international affairs, whereby the European Union emerges as a true alternative center of power, focus of power in international relations, besides Moscow and Beijing and maybe Tokyo and other states, that means that the European Union is going to have to become more autonomous from Washington. And if that occurs, that means the euro and the euro currency in international affairs is going to become a more important currency as an alternative currency in the world, beyond what it already is today, particularly if the United States is not going to cooperate as closely with Europe in dealing with Moscow. And that will provide even more incentive for countries that are not in the Eurozone, if they're forced to make a choice increasingly between Washington and Brussels, and that they're going to be forced or pushed to take a side. And that means being fully committed to the European model. particularly if they come to see, basically the United States is a problem. Remember, you know, that it's the Europeans that are paying the price for these policies. I mean, Ukraine is far away from the United States. So these millions of refugees that are coming into, that are leaving Ukraine, where are they going? They're not going to the United States. The United States is going to take, you know, maybe what, 100,000? Millions are coming into the European Union countries. If the United States is not willing to deal with climate change, where are these? Of course, the Americans are dealing with migration from Latin America, but Europe is going to deal with, it deals with the migration crisis from American policies destroying Iraq in 2003, or destroying Afghanistan and running away from Afghanistan last year. Europe is increasingly going to face these, the costs of American policies are going to become more and more evident to Europeans that will incentivize them to make themselves more autonomous, if not adversarial with the United States. And if you're not in the Eurozone, you don't have as much voice as you can or could have in shaping those European policies, because you do not have a representative on the European Central Bank. Okay, that's where I'll stop there. So you can now, let me have to shut down the computer now and move to my laptop.